Hello and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Today we are here to discuss a breaking story. Just hours ago, the United States has carried out massive attacks on Venezuela. There have been alarming reports, especially on social media, with regard to massive strikes, including airstrikes, being reported in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. And US President Donald Trump has confirmed that the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, has been captured and taken by US special forces out of the country. Now, these are absolutely unprecedented developments. This development would have wider implications for regional stability in the Americas region, and it could have a ripple effect that could destabilize the world order itself. So, in this video, let's understand what has happened. Let's understand the reasons behind it. And let's also break down the legality of these American military actions. And let's carry out an insightful and detailed analysis of these developments and understand its implications for the world order and especially for India. But first, the story so far. So, in the early hours of Saturday morning, there were reports on social media that large explosions were being reported in the capital of Venezuela in Caracas and as well as across multiple states in Venezuela. As you know, Venezuela is a South American country facing the Caribbean coastline. And over the last several months, the tensions have been building up between these two countries. And the US had carried out large scale military mobilization in the region. In fact, these developments were largely anticipated, it was largely expected. If you guys remember, 3 months ago, I had done a shorts on the very same topic, expecting such a conflict to arise in the coming days. We had discussed that US Venezuela happened to be the next big flashpoint, which could lead to another conflict that could destabilize the world. And that is exactly what has happened today. So, following these large scale military strikes by the United States, it has been reported and then confirmed by the US government that Nicolas Maduro has essentially been snatched by American special forces. Now, you don't often hear such reports of the leader of a country being captured and taken. So, if you look at the details of the operation that is emerging, though the details are still very sketchy, initial reports indicate that there were massive explosions, most likely aimed at taking out the air defense units of Venezuelan armed forces. Over the last couple of hours, I was going through all these videos circulating on social media, which are going viral. It clearly indicates that the initial strikes were aimed at eliminating Venezuela's air defense systems. Because this was essentially a preemptive operation to protect the American personnel and troops, especially the special forces and the covert units who were on the ground, who were deployed for the real phase of the operation, which was to capture the president and extract him out of the country. So, in order to ensure that American assets and the personnel are not targeted by the Venezuelan armed forces during this covert operation, the US has resorted to large scale military strikes. And reports are indicating that not just military sites, most probably even civilian targets might have been hit. So, though the details are still sketchy and unclear, and we are waiting for the US president to address the world and provide more clarity on as to what happened, at least the initial estimate clearly indicates large scale airstrikes aimed at military installations, along with the confirmed capture of the Venezuelan president. Now, before we talk about the details of this incident, understand the root causes, and evaluate its implications, I have a very important announcement for IAS aspirants. If you're looking for a guided program to help you prepare for your prelims and mains exam and the interview, Unacademy is providing the best possible offer as part of the New Year celebrations. You can now avail our course at just 17,999, which is a 60% off on our courses. And those interested, please click on the link provided in the video description. This offer, I'm told, ends on the 5th of January. And to avail the offer, you have to enter the code IAS English. And if you subscribe within the offer period, you'll not only get the 60% discount, but you also stand to get CSE Assure. For example, if for some reason, if you fail to clear the exam, your next attempt is completely on us under the CSE Assure program, provided if you meet certain conditions. So for further details, please click on the link provided in the video description. Now, coming back to our topic, the initial reports are indicating that this was a two-phased operation. where there was a covert operation underway led by US Special Forces, most likely the Delta Force of the US Army, which was working in coordination with CIA covert units on the ground in Caracas, which means the US intelligence had precise location of the president of Venezuela. It's not just the president, along with his wife. Both of them have been snatched by the American Special Forces and they have successfully extracted them out of the country. So, as this operation was underway, to provide cover to these special forces and covert units, large scale airstrikes were carried out. I mean, this is unheard of, unprecedented. This is something that you often see in movies and web series. It appears Trump is taking inspiration from the popular series Jack Ryan, right? Which largely focuses on the same theme, almost the exact same chain of events do occur in the show as well. The real world example I can think of, which is very similar to this, was back in 1989 when the then leader of Panama was snatched by American Special Forces. Manuel Noriega was snatched in a similar covert operation and taken out of the country. So, this is nothing new in this region. The US is known to carry out such interference and destabilize countries in Latin America. It has been involved in more than 2 dozen regime change operations since 1945 onwards. In fact, the first American misadventure was in the Central American country of Guatemala, where a legitimate government was toppled in order to fulfill the corporate interests of America's capitalist industries. Then going forward, US has carried out multiple misadventures, regime change operations and destabilization maneuvers across this region. For example, how elected governments were toppled in countries like Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and how leftist communist parties and governments in power were primarily targeted across Central America and South America. The ill fated Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, targeting Fidel Castro's regime. So there are numerous such examples to show the American hegemony in the region and how it has been repeatedly involved in such covert operations, military led operations, and as well as regime change operations. Now, what explains all of this? What is the root cause behind this? See, US under Donald Trump has been claiming that Nicolas Maduro is the kingpin of drug trafficking cartels based out of Venezuela, which are involved in large scale drug trafficking into the United States. I'm sure many of you must be aware that the Central America and Latin America region is affected by narco-terrorism, especially in Colombia, Mexico. There are multiple drug cartels that operate, including the infamous Pablo Escobar cartel and the Cali cartel and the others. But according to experts, most of the cartels in this region involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and narco terrorism, they operate in countries like Colombia and Mexico. But they do have networks and a presence in other countries as well, from Nicaragua to Honduras to Cuba to Venezuela as well. But usually, the route through which the drugs are trafficked is either through the Pacific, through the western part of the Pacific, directly towards Mexico and towards California, or through the land route. Land route is the most preferred route for trafficking the drugs. That is from South America via Central America directly into Mexico, from where the drugs are smuggled across the border into the US. And the aerial route is also often used. But Donald Trump has been alleging that Venezuela is the kingpin of these drug trafficking cartels, that through the Caribbean, these drugs are being trafficked into regions like Florida and into Mexico, and then from Mexico into the US. Though evidence suggests otherwise, Donald Trump had been claiming this under his first presidency as well. Back in 2020, Nicolas Maduro was charged with criminal conspiracy for trafficking and smuggling drugs into the US. So, on these charges, he's a wanted man in the US. And recently, the Trump administration has labeled Nicolas Maduro to be the head of an organization known as the Cartel of the Suns, Cartel de los Soles. Though experts dispute the existence of such a cartel, under Donald Trump, the US has been alleging that Nicolas Maduro is the kingpin of this organization. And in fact, this organization, along with Tren de Aragua, another known drug trafficking cartel based out of Venezuela, they have been labeled by the US as foreign terrorist organizations, which are headed by the president of Venezuela. So, though there isn't ample evidence to indicate this, that has been the allegation the US has been making. And in fact, Venezuela has been targeted with economic sanctions, which has crippled its economy and it has had a huge impact on the trade ability and the potential for Venezuelan oil exports as well. The other major issue for the Trump administration is the large scale illegal migration that happens from Venezuela to the US. Because, see, over the last few decades, Venezuela, under popular leftist leader Hugo Chavez, it saw a lot of welfare populist schemes being implemented. Then, finally, after Nicolas Maduro took over from Chavez, the economy has been largely mismanaged. He's been seen as an authoritarian leader who has crushed human rights, crushed democratic opposition. There are allegations of Maduro rigging the elections as well to stay in power. And apart from this, it is essentially believed that Nicolas Maduro is responsible for the economic destruction of the Venezuelan economy. Though the country is blessed with resources, the country has seen rampant inflation and lack of economic opportunities. So, this crisis has driven the population of Venezuela to largely seek better opportunities. And yes, it is true that there is a high degree of illegal migration flow from Venezuela to the United States. So, after Trump came back to power for the second term, since then, the Trump administration has made it a priority to tackle the problem of drug trafficking and illegal migration. In fact, the presidential campaign in the US was primarily based on these issues. So, Nicolas Maduro is held responsible for these threats to US security and US interests. Again, the validity of these arguments is questionable, but see, there is evidence available to indicate that within Venezuelan armed forces, there are criminal, corrupt elements involved in enabling drug and arms trafficking to some extent. But to accuse the president of being involved directly, it's a different matter altogether. Of course, the corrupt dictatorial government could be benefiting from it, profiting from the drug trafficking which might be occurring. But without ample evidence, blaming this on a foreign leader and a foreign state, labeling organizations as foreign terrorist organization, is also seen as blatant unilateral approach by the United States. So, based on these accusations, Trump blamed Nicolas Maduro for pumping cocaine, fentanyl, and even meth into the US, which has become a serious drug menace and a problem for the American society, particularly for the American youth. So, based on these charges, not only Nicolas Maduro is wanted in the US, but the US government has been openly targeting and threatening his administration, especially in the last 5 months. Under Donald Trump, large scale military mobilization was carried out and based out of Puerto Rico, which is a Caribbean territory, which is under the United States, and US has a major military base and a presence here. Large scale military deployments were carried out. Frontline warships, fighter jets, bomber aircraft, and drones, and even special forces were mobilized over the last few months. And an almost naval and air blockade was imposed across the Caribbean coastline of Venezuela. Apart from that, the US has been carrying out targeted operations against the boats moving in the Caribbean, alleging that these boats are smuggling drugs into the US. More than 2 dozen strikes have been carried out in the last 4 or 5 months, and 100 plus people have been killed. And these operations already had raised questions of legality under international law, and US was accused of instigating a conflict in the region. Venezuela rejected these charges, and it stood up against the bullying tactics of Trump administration and had even carried out a counter mobilization of troops. So the tensions had already heated up. So this development that we have seen was largely anticipated. It was most likely the possible outcome. Now, this also aligns with Trump's new national security strategy that was brought out last month. If you look at the new national security strategy of the US, Donald Trump, who seeks to make America great again, has made it a top priority to focus on the Western Hemisphere. The document talks about the retreat of the US from other global conflicts and reorienting US military, diplomatic, and intelligence focus on the Americas region, covering North America, Central America, and South America, prioritizing the Western Hemisphere as the strategic backyard of the United States. So, this policy aligns with Trump's domestic priority to please his vote base, to please his vote bank, that he is strict on the issue of drugs and illegal migration, because it was primarily on these issues that he was voted to power. Apart from that, it raises the specter of a possible regime change operation aimed at a government which is not aligned with American interests. See, Nicolas Maduro is no saint. The known fact that he's an authoritarian leader, he has plunged the country into a crisis, violated human rights and democratic principles. But just because of the fact that Maduro is aligned with the rivals and hostile powers to the United States like Russia, China, Iran, this could be a classic regime change operation engineered by the US to get rid of an uncomfortable leader and a government. See, the other concern is if you look at the Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded to Maria Machado, a well known Venezuelan democratic leader fighting for democratic elections and restoration of democracy, who has taken up a stand, a political stand against Nicolas Maduro. She was recently smuggled out of the country in a similar extraction operation led by the CIA and the US Special Forces in order to enable her to receive her Nobel Peace Prize and finally address the world and the media. She was taken out of the country from her safe house in a similar covert extraction carried out by private mercenary forces hired by US intelligence agencies. So, a repeat of this, now targeted at the US core target, that is the president of Venezuela, is what raises concern that this is mainly aimed at changing the regime, toppling the governments which are not aligned with American interests. And the bigger concern here is the US aiming at the natural resources of Venezuela? Is this also a hidden motive? In the process of making America great again and prioritizing the Western Hemisphere, is the interest on the resources and the wealth of Venezuela? Because Venezuela is known to hold the world's largest oil reserves and as well as many precious minerals and plays a key role in the global oil markets. So this would cripple the Venezuelan economy even further? And is there an attempt to take over the wealth and resources under the help of a favorable leader and a government by installing favorable leaders like Mario Machado in order to topple the existing Maduro regime? So, this is where the entire legality of the operation and the military activities of the US comes into question. Now, on what basis can US justify this operation? What does international law say about the use of military force? See, under the UN Charter, the UN Charter is very clear. Under Article 2, Clause 4, any use of force, even making the threat of using force against a country's sovereignty, is completely prohibited under Article 2, Clause 4. So, this is the stated international law. Violating the sovereignty of another nation is completely banned and prohibited. But there is an exception. Under Article 51, a country can act in self defense. But the condition is if it is attacked first. If it is under attack, then a country can act in self defense as per the exemption given under Article 51. But this does not apply in the current context because Venezuela had not attacked the US. You can't say that drug trafficking, illegal migration is a threat on American sovereignty. If there was a overt strike by Venezuelan forces on American interests or targets or American soil, then the right to self defense could have been invoked. So now the US cannot invoke the right to self defense, which is an exception under international law. Most likely, the US relies upon a doctrine known as preemptive defense. That is, even before a threat arises or even before an attack can happen, US has mainstreamed this legal doctrine that we will carry out attacks in preemptive defense. That is, if we have information that there is a future threat which is going to come, we will carry out strikes preemptively. And this is in a legal gray area. If you look at international law, the doctrine of preemptive self defense comes under a gray zone where the international law is not well defined. And this again highlights the limitations of international law and institutions like the United Nations. It highlights the weakness of the UN from preventing such blatant misuse of military power and the blatant display of aggression. Just like Russia largely went uh, unpunished for its violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, most likely the US will get away with this, including the killing of more than 100 people in Caribbean waters by targeting the boats, by alleging that these were drug traffickers. Though US might have a legitimate reason as far as countering drug trafficking is concerned, that alone is not a reason enough to carry out these strikes in international waters and the territory of another country, violating its sovereignty. And of course, you can't be snatching the leaders of another country. So this is blatantly illegal as per international law. But if you look at what Donald Trump has posted on social media, it's very carefully worded. Look at the statements made by Donald Trump following the attacks that began. He said that the arrest of Nicolas Maduro is calling it an arrest. And he said it was made under the presence of US law enforcement, meaning they're trying to give it a legal endorsement. That since Maduro is wanted in the US on criminal charges, on these charges, he's being arrested by American authorities. So, most likely, in this covert military operation led by US Special Forces, there were US law enforcement officials present, like submitting a warrant and taking him into custody along with his wife. But this is where the problem arises again. Maybe if Nicolas Maduro is still wanted in the US, how will US justify the extraction of his wife as well? This again is blatantly against international law. Then, if you look at what US Senator Mike Lee has posted, he said he has spoken to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Most likely, this conflict is not going to drag or extend. US is not looking at a full scale invasion, or it's not looking to occupy the country or topple the government as of now. So, the immediate priority appears to be the capture of Maduro and ensure he faces trial in an American court and gets sentenced for a prison term for charges of drug trafficking. This appears to be the intent of this operation. But however, things can easily spiral out of control. Look at the reactions of Venezuela. The vice president, the defense minister, and the armed forces have come out in unison, criticizing these American acts as imperialist acts. And Venezuela has started carrying out a massive mobilization, preparing for any eventuality. So this could easily escalate and probably lead to a potential conflict between the American forces deployed in the Caribbean and the Venezuelan armed forces. If at all Venezuela holds back and doesn't retaliate, even then it threatens to destabilize the region and it legitimizes these illegal actions. That's why global powers aligned with Venezuela are critical of American actions, be it Iran, be it Russia, China, and even the other important powers of Latin America. They've all condemned these actions, and an urgent meeting of the UNSC has been called for. But however, what does this development mean for the world order? How would this affect the global oil markets? How would this affect the larger stability across the world? Because see, the concern here is if US is so blatant in targeting Venezuela, in carrying out such actions, if Russia also got away with its violations against Ukraine, this is only going to encourage other powers like China, especially to make a move on Taiwan. For years, China has been talking about capturing Taiwan and integrating it with the mainland, which has been a core objective of the Communist Party. Just a couple of days ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping has again reiterated that in 2026, China will probably make an attempt to capture and take Taiwan. Though China is known to make such rhetorical statements, now you might have to see this in with greater seriousness. Given the fact that US, Russia, even Israel has gotten away for its blatant use of force and violation of international law, China would only feel more emboldened. So, such acts by global powers will undermine international law, it will undermine the rules based order, and it will push the world towards more chaos and a probable larger conflict that could push the world towards a probable global conflict as well. But the impact on oil markets and commodities is expected to be limited as of now. Of course, there might be some sudden shock by tomorrow or by Monday when the markets open. There might be slight jump in oil prices, gold, silver, etc. But this is expected to be limited because, as I said, US is not looking at further military action in Venezuela. And as per initial reports, they're likely to end the hostilities for now, unless Venezuela retaliates. So if the war doesn't escalate and if US is not looking at a full-on invasion, most likely the markets are going to stabilize. But yes, it is going to disrupt the supply of oil from Venezuela. It is likely to have an impact on the supply routes and the shipping routes in the region because there are countries like Peru, then there you also have Argentina, Bolivia. They all have major exports, including critical strategic minerals. So the supply of the essential items and commodities could face some disruption if the tensions increase, if there are more blockades, or if there are frequent tensions and conflicts. And this is something which could threaten the global economy. And apart from that, the risk of undermining the rules based order. That is the biggest concern, which could push countries like China to show similar aggression and in the hopes that they'll get away with it without any implications. So, what does this mean for India? See, India never supports such unilateral military action. But at the same time, it will create a dilemma for us when it comes to choosing between US and Venezuela. It would be very similar to the challenge we face between Russia and Ukraine. US would be very crucial for us as a trade partner, as a defense partner. And we already know that under Trump, the US is very transactional. And if India were to, let's say, take a stand against the US intervention, it is likely to reflect in Trump's trade policies. And it is likely to create more complexities for India. At the same time, India can't stay silent about the blatant violation of sovereignty of Venezuela and the snatching of the sitting president, right? So this is where India would calibrate its approach. India would most likely wait and watch for Trump's official statement, which will come in a few hours. Then maybe India is going to react. But as of now, the direct implications are going to be limited for India. The presence of Indian diaspora is negligible in Venezuela. It's less than 500 Indians who are present in the country, who are Indian citizens or NRIs. So, in that regard, India has nothing much to worry about. But of course, the safety of our diplomats and whoever Indians are present there, their safety, well being would be a concern. But India could easily evacuate them if at all the conflict were to escalate because the numbers are very, very small. Economic impact, again, likely to be limited because India, anyways, had limited trade with Venezuela since American sanctions were imposed. Though we did have some oil investments, we had already scaled back those projects, mainly because of the threat of American sanctions. But now the question would be, how would India navigate this? Would we side with US or with Venezuela or come out with a more nuanced position? Because India would be mindful that this would have impact on China's future behavior as well. This is something that China would learn from. That China is already showing that kind of aggression in East China Sea, and China could probably use such aggression against India as well. So, if India doesn't take a stand now, later garnering global support against Chinese aggression could create problems for India. That is the primary challenge for us, the diplomatic position that India would take. We can't really go against the United States, just like we couldn't go against Russia, obviously. At the same time, you can't abandon your other idealistic commitments as well. So, striking this balance between realistic and idealistic goals of India would be the challenge for us. So, let's end the discussion with this. Once there are more updates on this topic, we will have a more detailed analysis. So, what do you think about this? Is the US right in carrying out such military action? Or do you think US should be condemned for the blatant violation of international law? Please let me know in the comments. That is it. Thanks for watching.